Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with. Today's episode is a stroll through the history of Detroit, specifically its broadcast and print media. We also discuss politics in what we know as the Motor City. To get the best take on these vast topics, we're delighted to have Tim Kiska as our guest. He has a PhD in history from Wayne State in Detroit. Tim started his journey as an 18-year-old when he got a job at the Detroit Free Press. He has worked for the Detroit News also. He's a political consultant for Channel 7 in Detroit and WWJ Radio. He teaches journalism and screen studies at Wayne State. He knows all there is to know about the great city of Detroit. He's a friend who's a fabulous resource, so sit back and relax. From journalism, from Coleman Young to Kwame Kilpatrick to politics to broadcast media to soupy sales to Sonny Elliott, enjoy Detroit's story in my conversation with Tim Kiska. Well, a PhD in history from Wayne State, Mr. Kiska, a master's in history, and a career in the newspaper business starting in 1970. And you've been a political consultant with WXYZ TV since 2006. So you're well-versed in pretty much everything we want to talk about, which includes Detroit, its media, its newspapers, its politics, and the state. You're just the man. You know everything.
Oh, well, in the Valley of the Blind, Jim, the one-eyed man is king, I suppose. I don't know.
Well, tell me about the history. First of all, I want to talk newspapers. And
Sure.
this city, this community was blessed in the old days with the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press. I mean, I loved getting up and having two newspapers and looking at both sports sections and having the opportunity to see the different takes and columns from like Joe Falls and Jerry Green on competing newspapers. It was the best Sunday morning available over a cup of coffee. That's all gone now, isn't it?
There's still competition, I can guarantee you that. On a kind of a lower level, but I'm working on something right now, and I know the news is working on the same thing. And I'm working on this as a freelance basis for the Free Press, and my instincts still kick in, which is I want to make sure that I hammer these guys. So no, the competition is still there. They're in the same building. The business offices are the same for both papers, but that competition is no question about it. It's still there. And if you get beat on a story, even though, it's still, you still pay attention to that. It still hurts if you get beat. So no, that competition is still around.
The question is, and I go back, the days of 70s on up to the 80s and 90s before the merger, where the two papers kind of became one, were those the halcyon days of newspapers?
Well,
where the guys were on the street. You had columnists like the Waldmeyers out there that were newsmakers themselves in many ways. Are those days over, or are those days still alive, but it's just down at a lower level?
No, it's different. I don't know if it's a lower level or not, but I'm on a couple things. It's over. Here's what's over. I think that for years it was the news and the Free Press, and they kind of set the agenda, for discussion in the town. So in other words, if you were in Calvert's column, for instance, everybody would know about it. Or if, the Free Press or the news wrote about something that happened about Detroit City Council, that was the thing that everybody talked about. And I think it gave everybody a common experience. So in other words, if you and I were going out to lunch at Giannopolis years ago, we were all both sort of, in the same ballpark. I think that's changed. The common experience is sort of given away. Facebook is where a lot of people are on that. It's not a common experience. That's not a common experience at all. What you might be seeing every day might be something totally different from what I'm seeing. So I think that part's going away, and I think that we're nothing's really replaced it. We're in a different just a different world now. Yeah, and I think it's slowly revealing itself. I don't know where we are, anymore. Really. It's just a total puzzle to me.
Well, as a history professor, that would be a puzzle because you're trying to impart to youngsters trying to learn about things that this is the way it used to be, and I don't know where we are right now. How do you kind of couch that to a student?
Well, it's sort of like, well, first of all, I mean, I still think, there's a ton of great journalism out there. I mean, I'd argue that maybe we're in another golden era right now.
Really?
But yeah. Well, here's why. Let
me just show you the devil's advocate, because I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, journalism is dead."
No. There's a lot of stuff. First of all, getting information. Now, for instance, once upon a time, if let's say I'm just making this up, then maybe it's going to goofball example. But if I wanted to tell you, find out, okay, what's the population of Garden City, or what's the racial makeup of Detroit in 1930, something like that, or what was unemployment like in this city in 1955. All of these kind of stuff. How did Macomb County vote in 1960? Before, that would be, you'd have to put your hat and coat on and go someplace like the library. Maybe the newspaper library have it. Maybe it wouldn't. But then what would happen is, it would take you a while to get it. Now it's all there at a click of a mouse. I do election night stuff, exit polling kind of things.
Yeah.
I've been doing that since 1974.
And a great job, I might add. Channel 7's lucky to have you.
Well, yeah, maybe, yeah, but the bottom line is stuff that used to take me a week. Logistical operations that I'd have to do would take a week because of modern technology would take me a day, sometimes an hour. The stuff that I've just got on my own computer right now is, the statistical program I've got is probably something way better than, let's say, NBC would have had in 1976. So also, by the way, the reach these days. That's why I'm also arguing that maybe we're in another golden age. I did an obituary the other day on a guy named Kurt Ludke, who ran the Detroit Free Press in the 60s and the 70s. I wrote that thing. It hit the web Sunday afternoon. Within 3 hours, this thing was all over the place around the country. People were responding to it. I do this, your podcast, my podcast. I can keep track of where my podcast gets downloaded.
Right.
25 different countries across the world. So go figure.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I think that we're on the cusp of something pretty amazing. That we just haven't grasped yet because it's still sort of, unveiling itself. But, the good old days, yeah, they were great. It was a golden era, but maybe we're in another golden era, perhaps. And the other half of this too, Jim, is, you've been around the block a few times. Whether you like it or not, it doesn't matter. We're here.
Yeah, that was my next question. The cynic in me, or the cynic friends of mine, you said it's an amazing time. Is it amazing for the good or amazing for the bad?
Both, in my opinion.
That's a great answer, and I agree with you. You're right that the internet has given us an information age where we can sit at a desk and do things that we could never imagine doing 25 years ago.
That's right.
And the research is so easy, and you can find so much out. But that being said, maybe it's how it's being disseminated and in the form it's being disseminated maybe is where we're, I don't want to say getting off track, but in some people's minds, getting off track.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I agree. I think we're getting off track. Part of it is that, and I'm not going to say, I hope I'm not sounding cynical here. Okay, when you and I were coming up.
That's my job.
Yeah, all right. Okay, all right. But, look, when I was in college, which was like right after the Civil War, I swear to God, but anyhow, it was many years ago, but everybody watched Walter Cronkite.
Sure.
Or Don Chancellor, or Harry Reasoner and Howard K. Smith. And that was a big chunk of it. I mean, that's what you did. You read the Free Press or the news, maybe both. When I was in college, if you wanted to get read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, there were only about 3 or 4 places in the city, which is a big city, that you could get a hold of that day's paper.
I think the only place I could imagine you could get it is you had to go to the library, didn't you?
No, well, I went to Wayne State,
Okay.
and there was a place right off outside of in one of the buildings where there was a box that you could buy it. Downtown, there were 2 newsstands that you could buy it, but that was it. End of story. But now, okay, there's all this stuff out there, but now what you can do is you can build your own little bubble, and you don't have to hear anything outside of your little bubble. So if you happen to think one certain way, you can watch Fox News and watch Rush, and then maybe read the Washington, maybe a couple of different conservative news sites. You can do that. If you think a different way, you can watch Rachel Maddow. You can read somebody else, and you can cut off anybody on your Facebook feed that doesn't agree with you. So now you can run around and you don't have to listen to anybody that you don't want to listen to anymore. And I'm beginning to wonder if that's sort of causing a problem. The other one is, short version is, I think that this foreign interference is believe me, I'm not a conspiracy monger whatsoever, but there's an opportunity here because, before, if it was Jim Branstadter versus Tim Kiska running for Senate, right? I bought TV advertising. By the way, you buy TV advertising, that's a public document. In other words, I go in and buy $50,000 worth of stuff on Channel 7, time on Channel 7. You can walk in right behind me, look at the piece of paper that says how much I paid for it, what shows I'm advertising on it. This is all public documents. Now you've got, and it's been documented, where the Russians were throwing stuff up on Facebook and stirring things up. Well, we figured it out, what was going on, but what's going to happen this time around, Jim? I don't know. And also, you've got apparently the Chinese and the Iranians in the game. And what they're going to do?
Right. The problem is
I don't know.
Yeah. And here's the problem: they're behind the curtain, and it's about finding someone who can get behind the curtain, and with credibility, and tell us that who's doing what where, because that's the thing I find most disturbing. You just mentioned it, a conspiracy theory. It's probably not, but the reality of life is, it would be nice to know for sure. And we're kind of still out there guessing, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Well, this was all documented in different federal investigations about the Russians. And, it got sort of eclipsed on, by, did Donald Trump know about this stuff or not? I'm not sure that was the point. I think the point was, I'm just saying all of this. Is this a good time, or is this good, or is this bad? I think that this is sort of, because of the international reach of the web. Boy, who knows? Where we're headed on all of this.
Yeah, that's true.
So, and we're in a hell of a, down the road. So this is, so your podcast can stand, a year or two from now. This is going to keep on going for quite some time.
I think so. I think you're absolutely right. Until we figure it out. And again, I think by the time you figure some of these things out, there's a new little hole that allows the camel to get their nose under the tent again.
You got it.
Isn't that crazy?
So
think about the news.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. Think about the newspapers. You go back. The names who are the stalwarts of the newspapers. We had the Evening News Association, the Post Newsweek, or whatever. The people that became larger than life in many ways. You just mentioned one of them, Kurt Ludke, but also Neil Shine. Were these? Were these guys icons, if you will, in Detroit? And what made them icons in regards to all of us Detroiters? Because we basically were reading their information that they edited and sent to us through those 2 big newspapers.
I think you're right. Now you mentioned Kurt and Neil were two guys that were my mentors. I joined the Free Press in 1970 at age 18. Believe it or not, 18.
That's great.
I was a kid, and those two guys kept an eye on me, taught me a ton, and here's where they were why they were icons. Both Shine and Ludke had very high standards. So, for instance, Shine and I would not joke about this, but he was serious about this. Jerry Kavanaugh, the former mayor of Detroit, if somebody came in and spelled his name wrong in copy, it's Cavanagh. There is no U in there. Shine would go bat crazy. Kelly.
That's a perfectionist, but that's what you needed in those days. You wanted to be accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And in broadcasting as well. Frank Kelly, the Attorney General, that was another one he kept an eye on, Kelley. And that was one thing he kept an eye on. The other one is he would call people aside as they got hired in, and they would say, look, if I ever find you trying to, surreptitiously peddle some kind of imagined political agenda, my hand is going to be around your throat. So don't even try. So that was, they established high standards. Really, Ludke in particular, I wrote about this in his obituary. He was the kind of guy that after the 1967 riot, rebellion, whatever you want to call it, 43 people died. And most people, I think, assumed, well, all 43 people, these people were rioters. Ludke sent out three reporters, three of the best reporters. I know three of these folks real well later. Went out and did, I think it was 300 interviews in 5 weeks. Came back, and of all these 43 people, almost all of them were people that were just at the wrong place at the right time. Some bullets would start flying, and boom, they're gone.
Yeah.
Ludke comes in on a Saturday morning. These three reporters have delivered their stories in stacks of notes. He's armed with two things: a couple of black coffees, big black coffees, and a pack of Marlboros. And in one sitting, went kaboom, wrote this whole thing out, and it ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize for the Free Press. It was one of the things that won him the Pulitzer Prize in 1968. That's why these guys were iconic. They were perfectionists. They knew a lot about the city. Even though Kurt wasn't a native, Neil certainly was, and Kurt really adopted this town. Even well after he won the Academy Award for writing out of Africa, he could have moved to Los Angeles, and he never did. He stayed right here in Birmingham. So these folks they loved the city. Not just they loved the city, but they kind of spurred the staff on to continue doing, really good, groundbreaking work. And I can say the same thing about the Detroit News, by the way, not the blather. They have some equally iconic people over there. But if you think about Detroit News, has been around since 1873. I can name a bunch of stuff that would not be here without the Detroit News. Belle Isle would still be somebody's private island without the Detroit News. The Detroit Institute of Arts, that gorgeous building there on right near Wayne State, they're the ones who pushed for that kind of thing. Cranbrook out there, out in Oakland County, that was George Booth, one of the news guys. I could go on and on and on. Stuff that that the news pushed for years, that they had that kind of pull, that kind of influence.
See, and I agree 100%. That's why I thought that those days, it's like today, those papers don't have that kind of impact, that kind of pull and push, if you will, on a community. And that's why I kind of think we've lost that from at least the newspaper end. Am I right or wrong?
Totally. Well, no, you're absolutely right. And let me give you, this is sort of the dying gasp. When Jim Schaefer and M.L. Elric were investigating Kwame Kilpatrick.
Right.
The News, the Free Press together spent $1 million in attorney's fees to get what they needed, and also to keep them from being sued for libel. In other words, there were a certain set of documents that they had to sue for, and the bottom line, I think they got about 200,000 of that back. But how many bloggers do you know could come up with that kind of dough? If you went over, I'm not picking Channel 7 out of the hat, but if I went over into the general manager's office at Channel 7 and said, okay, Kwame's a crook, but we're going to need $1 million to bring him into the dock. Jim, what do you think the answer would be?
No, thanks. We'll work it another way. Unless they could find a donor or a sugar daddy out there and say, here's $1 million for your legal fees, then they do it. But they weren't going to do it for quote unquote. I don't think anybody does these days, their civic duty.
Right. Well, no. And one other X factor and the same thing right after the 67 riot. The question becomes, of course, Jim, okay, the town just got burned down. What went wrong here? So the Free Press decided maybe we should do a survey of the African-American community in particular. There were white rioters, so we kind of a more general survey. But, what's the problem here? They didn't have the money in the budget. It was about $10,000 in 1967 money, which is, fair, big chunk of change. Yeah. So Frank Angelo, the managing editor, calls up Henry Ford II and said, look, Henry, we need 10 grand to do this right. And he said, no problem. Here's the check. Yeah.
It's a different, you said it earlier, it's a different world we live in. That kind of thing wouldn't happen today.
Right, exactly. And so that's where I think we're, particularly local newspapers. This is, by the way, this just isn't in Detroit where they're weakened. It is coast to coast. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, we're all doing real well. It's Cleveland, the plain dealer, once like a pillar of that community, in big trouble. Miami Herald, which was like its own empire, its own planet, is not nearly what it's been. And you've been, you've traveled a lot over your career. I'm sure if you've seen it. And I think there's a great line I heard from a guy named David Simon, who wrote The Wire. He's a former newspaper reporter. He says, this is the best time ever to be a crook in politics because nobody's watching.
Yeah. And that goes back to, again, the thing, going back to our media point, go to the television, say, era back in those days, too. The same time we're talking about middle 70s, late 60s, on up into the 90s and the 2000s. When you had television stations in town, you had specific reporters who were just assigned to, quote unquote, the automobile industry. You had your crime guy, like Joe Weaver at Channel 2. He was the auto guy. Jim Harrington at Channel 7. He was your politics guy. He didn't get a general assignment story and go out and cover a car crash or a snowstorm on I-75. Jim was doing politics the whole time. That's gone from our television business kind of too, isn't it? And that's I don't know, part of the sign of the times maybe, or part of the sign of our different interests as consumers. What do you think?
I think it's a sign of the times. You mentioned Harrington, by the way. I remember I was covering, it was Coleman Young's inauguration, the second one, would have been 1978. And I remember Jim and I were standing next to each other at one of the inaugural parties. I said, man, I know some of these people, but not a lot. And then Jim goes around the room, starts pointing out, and says, okay, there's this so-and-so. He's the number 3 guy in Parks and Rec. There's this other guy over number 2. He's over in the finance department. This other person is number. He knew everybody. And they knew him. So when you were, let's put it this way, you've covered football for all of these years.
Yeah.
People know you and they trust you because you've developed credibility over a long period of time, earned that credibility. people will tell you, if you're covering a story involving football of some sort, people are going to trust you because they trust you. But if I came in just fresh, covering a U of M football game or something like that, and I don't know how forthcoming they would be necessarily until they kind of trusted me.
The familiarity and the trust is a big issue in regards to getting some information. And again,
Absolutely.
you know this as a reporter and as a journalist, that you also can't burn somebody.
Well, no, you can't burn them unfairly.
Exactly. I mean, if you burn somebody, all that information dries up after a moment.
Right. But I think that most people, my experience is they may be angry. You're absolutely right about that. My joke has been that Detroit's a small town. It's only got 5 people and $10, and they keep on getting passed around. And that's true. I mean, when I was covering courts, for instance, I was covering autos for not that long, 2 or 3 years, but I know that all the auto companies had files on all the reporters. That's not as sinister as it sounds, but they knew who the cheap shot artists were. And the cheap shot artists never lasted very long. They went up real fast and they went down because nobody talked to them. Whereas the people like Weaver would be a good example that they trust, who's not going to screw it up, who's also going to go out there and tell the truth and get both sides of the story. They talk to him and he'd break stories. A guy named Ben Marshall.
Venny was another one. And you know what? The word that comes to mind is respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
They respected those guys for doing their jobs, even though they may step on a toe or two. They understood it. The guys that had their toes stepped on, they understood this is part of the job. This is part of the business I'm in. So it didn't last. It was still that respect between those guys, as long as it wasn't unfair.
That's right. Exactly. And in fact, by the way, if you didn't report the bad stuff, you wouldn't get any respect because they'd think, well, that Kiska guy, he's just who knows, he's soft touch.
During our conversations, you've already mentioned 3 mayors. You have watched the political scenery through Detroit over the years, and you started with Kavanaugh, and you went to Kwame, and then to Coleman Young, and in between there was Archer, there was Dave Bing, there was Kenny Cockrell, there was Roman Gribbs. You've seen all of this go. Tell me, Detroit has had a history of mayors. Coleman was one of those unique individuals that ran this city. I kind of liken him to Daley. It may not have been pretty, but somehow he was able to get it done. And Kwame got caught. Dennis Archer came in to clean up. I mean, tell me how go through the names of those mayors and just kind of give me a quick thought on the passing scene over all those years. Your history on this town is just great, and I would love to get your take on it.
Well, I mean, trying to do a Reader's Digest version, Kavanaugh, an amazing figure. Here's a guy that got elected in '61, running against an incumbent, Louis Mariani, and he shouldn't have won, but he did because he knew what he was doing. Tragic figure because a couple things. '67 happened, and he burned some political bridges. I think he was a tragic figure, a guy that might have been president, I think, under a certain different set of circumstances. But I mean, there were a lot of things burbling up in this town throughout the 50s that didn't really come to the surface, but they came to the surface when he was mayor. Gribbs was only there for 4 years. I think did the best he could. But he was kind of like a caretaker. And by the way, Gribbs, this is not meant as any kind of denigration whatsoever. He was a thoroughly decent guy. I think his big thing was, I think he wanted to be a judge more than anything else. Huh. But he was there for one term.
Yep.
You had Coleman, which I have a slightly different take on Coleman, which is that a lot of people think, well, his image is of this angry guy. I don't know if you've ever spent any time with the guy. He's funny. Funnier than hell.
Very funny and fun-loving. I mean, a couple of times when they used to have that stag steakout, I'll never forget, they called him. He was in Hawaii. And his opening line to greet everybody was the room fell down in laughter.
That's right. We can't say it even. You could say it on the podcast, but you don't want to.
But we're not going to. No. But
right.
But that's what that and Coleman, I thought, was a manipulator of people and politics to his ends.
Mm-hmm.
And very good at it. I mean, if you want to talk about a consummate politician, would that be correct in talking about Coleman Young?
Yeah, to a degree. I think that he misplayed a couple of things.
Yeah, I would agree.
I'm not sure, but see, I'm not sure he could have done anything about white flight.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of the problem you've got is people to this day say, well, this town was great until he got there. This town was actually starting to lose manufacturing base in the early 50s. It's been and losing population starting then. So I think this trend had been going on for a long time before he even got there. I'm not sure much. I don't know how much he could have done about this. But I mean, he was thoroughly competent. By the way, really interesting. He always balanced the budget. Always balanced the budget.
And again, a lot of people remember some of the flamboyant stuff. Don't remember some of that nitty-gritty stuff that you just talked about, the budget.
Yeah, actually, it was kind of weird. He wasn't that flamboyant. I mean, he liked to dress well. His dad worked partly as a tailor, but he didn't live all that wild. I mean, I think his big thing was he'd just take the limo back to Manoogian and sit around and play solitaire and watch sports. I think that was. I don't think he wasn't all that wild. You had Archer, who was, trying to deal with a lot of stuff that, as I said, have been, dealing with a long time. A thoroughly decent guy, in my opinion.
Like Dennis a lot.
Yeah. You get Kwame, who was a incredible charmer and politician. If you walked in the room, if you spent some time with him, he walked in a room. I don't know if you've ever hung around with the guy before he went to jail. Totally charming. Great. Let's put it this way: there's a certain thing, and this is not meant phony at all. You've been as much as anybody been around the block. You get somebody who you sit there and spend some time with them, and they make you the center of their universe for that moment. John Dingell was that way, where I used to go to his Christmas party, and he'd talk, and I've been a reporter for almost 50 years, right? And I'd spend some time, 5 minutes with a guy, and then I'd move on down the line. I go, wow, this is pretty cool. One of the most powerful people in the United States of America thinks I'm a cool guy.
Yeah.
And then I would slap myself and say, no, he's being nice to the institution,
At least but again, that was their charm. That was part of their strength. And they didn't do that to just you. They did it to everybody in the room, like you just said about Kwame.
Kavanaugh was, oh my God, Kavanaugh was so good at that kind of stuff. Archer is good at that stuff.
Yep.
It's a real trait. Well, Kwame could have gone, he could have been huge, but he had this obvious deficit in his brain, which is he didn't know right, from wrong. And, wow, you saw what happened. You've seen what happens. He's going to spend another 20 years plus, in a federal penitentiary someplace.
Yeah. It's a shame. I mean, a lot of talent there that he was his own worst enemy, I guess. That's the best way to put it.
Oh, yeah. Well, not while the U.S. attorney was in town.
That's true. Forgot about that part.
Yeah, and Kim Worthy, too, by the way. I mean, Kim Worthy, by the way, the Wayne County prosecutor, was under a lot of pressure to kind of just let it go. And to her credit, she didn't buckle.
She gets strong marks.
Yeah, and I mean, I say a lot of pressure, from pretty powerful people saying, "Look, he'll quit if you just don't charge him." And her thing was, well, wait a minute, there are a whole bunch of guys in Jacktown that have done a lot less than that are going to be there for a long time. So no, we're not going to be looking the other way on this.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I don't think I'm being indiscreet here. Jim Schaefer and Elric, who I'm close with, had done these stories, and they thought this would kind of go away. Both of them thought, well, people are going to go say, well, that's our Kwame, and that was going to be the end of that. They were stunned when Kim Worthy held a press conference and says, I'm kind of interested in this, and you could have knocked him over with a spoon. So that's where we are now. Cockrell, I think of the world of Ken Cockrell Jr. And he wasn't there long enough to unfortunately, to make a mark.
And what about Dave Bing too? I mean,
I love that guy, but I think what happened there was, first of all, the city was so far gone financially,
and there was. I always thought that Dave took on this job and didn't realize how deep the morass was, and it was.
I'm sure that's true.
And it was almost an impossible try to fix it. And I think it just not defeated him, but I think it frustrated him to the point where he just said, "This is a lost cause."
Yeah, there's nothing he could have done. There was just nothing he could have done because what had been going on with the books had been going on for a long time, and by the way, not without warning. I mean, you mentioned Cockrell. Well, Sheila Cockrell, who was on the city council for many terms,
yep,
was practically standing on the table saying, "Look, man, this is the Titanic heading for the iceberg. We've got to start doing some cuts. We've got to start doing stuff to, tighten our belts," which is odd coming from a Marxist, but she's very clear-eyed about all of that stuff. So by the time Dave got there, the Titanic had already hit the iceberg and the ship was sinking.
It was on its way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on its way. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to just say currently then Mike Duggan has kind of righted the ship, or is starting to put the airbags underneath the Titanic and getting it back up to the surface, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think what happened is the bankruptcy it gave the city an opportunity to get things back in order.
And real quickly, Tim, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but that was necessary, wasn't it? That had to happen, didn't it?
Yes. I mean, it look, I'm not a municipal finance expert, but you're right. I mean, it was just things that have been going downhill for so long that somebody had to come in, and the elected officials, particularly city council, whose job it was to sort of deal with this kind of stuff, they weren't going to deal with it. They just weren't. And so ultimately, that's what that bankruptcy law, that municipal bankruptcy law is for, to fix that. So he gets a lot of props for, staying the course, and he's doing a lot of stuff, cleaning the city up in terms of abandoned buildings and things like that need to be done. And he's done a lot of stuff. Downtown looks a lot better than it did 10, 15 years ago. But as I heard from a friend of mine, we got, 1 square mile down, 162 more to go,
It's a big, it's a big job, but I think at least things are looking up, which for the city of Detroit and this community, I think is a good way to look at it, in my opinion, anyway.
Sure.
And can I move on to one of your books you wrote, From Soupy to Nuts, a history of Detroit television? And we've been talking politics, which is what I wanted to go. This is why you're such a great guest for this, to have this talk, because we can go to places where I love too. I love the city of Detroit, its history. But from Soupy to Nuts, Soupy Sales, you also were a dear friend of Sonny Elliott back in those days. Talk to me about the history of Detroit television and your take on it, because I think as a guy that was brought up, I was so lucky to have been in our business. Started here in Detroit. I started in 72, but I was in Saginaw, then Jackson. Came here in like 78, 79, and then was able to watch this array of talent. Sonny was unbelievable, but Billy Bonds was in the mix. Mort Krim, all of these guys that, in my opinion, were, that to me, those were the golden days of Detroit area television. 2, 4, and 7 fighting each other in competition, creating really good local newscasts. And you kind of put it together on that Detroit history of Detroit news and Detroit television.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of what you were seeing is, the reason I wrote this book in the first place is that what anybody growing up in Detroit would have seen, and what you saw too, is each city kind of had its own unique brand of local TV. So in other words, if you were growing up there, Soupy Sales would be a good example. Nobody else had Soupy, even though Los Angeles.
Nobody else had Sonny Elliott either.
Right, exactly. There was nobody quite like that. So everybody sort of, and Bill Bonds, same thing. Nobody had anybody. I mean, every city had its own unique. If you go to Cleveland, they had their own cast of characters. If you went to Chicago, their own cast of characters. So TV was pretty unique from city to city to city. But because of the way the industry is now, everybody's watching pretty much the same thing from coast to coast, with the exception of their newscasts. And even the newscasts look pretty much, I mean, they're very similar in format, and so that's kind of why I wrote that book. I mean, you don't have movie hosts anymore.
No.
You just don't. Yeah,
Conrad Patrick and who was Sheila Bell?
Oh, Rita Bell.
Rita
oh
Bell,
my God,
yeah.
Rita Bell. Oh, prize movie, just amazing. Keep on going. Bill Kennedy was, of course,
Thanks for bringing him up. He was a treasure.
Yeah, he's the treasure. So I wanted to get those, because they're not just memories; they're part of who we are. This is our culture. This is part of being. This is why being a Detroiter is different from being somebody in Lexington, Kentucky, or someplace like that. And so we had our own brand of TV. You saw the news. The news departments were extraordinary. There's always been this sort of thing that I think I've always thought it was actually kind of a myth. It's been a myth since the early 70s that it was the TV people, the print people didn't like the TV people and vice versa. And I never found that to be true because, for instance, when I was covering federal court, and this would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, well, Vince Wade was standing next to me the whole time.
Yeah. I know it's not true because you walk into the Anchor Bar over there across from Channel 4 in Lafayette at any point in time. You'd see, Joe Weaver in there. You might see Vic Caputo in there with a couple of Detroit News or Detroit Free Press people. All of them talking about this, about that. Bob Bennett would be in there talking with the crime guy from the news or the Free Press. Yeah,
exactly. And all I can tell you, I basically grew up as a print guy, and all I can tell you is that when I was covering something with Vince, and Joe and all the rest of these, Bob in particular, Bennett.
Yeah.
God, these guys.
Boomer. We called him Boomer. He's my favorite. Worked with Boomer for 3 years.
Boomer was, I could go on for hours about him, but won't. But he was just a great reporter. He knew stuff. So we all the print reporters had all the respect in the world for the TV people, the radio people. My favorite was a guy named Bill Black at WJR, who Bill was, just a fiend for accuracy. I'll give you a very brief story. We were covering there was a Wayne County strike. And there was a court hearing, and it went on till like midnight. And we finished our stories. We had to the Anchor at 1. Just for the record, neither one of us was even remotely drunk. and we're going through our notes together, and there was some kind of minor point that was in about my 25th paragraph. And he said, "I'm not sure that's right." And I'm going, "Oh my God," And so it's 1 o'clock in the morning. Pre-cell phone, so we get out our quarters and they put them into they look for the county attorney's name. We get it in the phone book, call up, it's the guy's dad. At this point, it's 1:15 in the morning. Is so-and-so here?
And alcohol wasn't involved?
Was not involved.
You're stretching my credibility there, Tim.
No, because we just didn't get there until like 1 in the morning.
Uh-huh.
So we're still sober. Now, by the way, 45 minutes later, I'm not sure I could make that claim after that. But the guy says, "Oh no, that's my son. Let me give you his number." But the fact is that Bill in particular, was so a fiend for accuracy that the fact that this thing might be wrong, even though it was a minor, inconsequential point, made both of us crazy. So I don't know if I'm off their point, but yes, Detroit had its own unique brand of TV. There was nothing like it. And we were both lucky to have seen it, I mean, geez.
We
Great
were
stuff to,
very, very lucky.
Yeah.
We've gone all over. I kind of missed the governors and the statewide stuff, but that's okay. Detroit was really interesting to me. We've gone over the newspaper business and journalism, but there's one other thing I need you to do before we finish. And you've written about it. You wrote a wonderful story in 2018 about a moment you had with Fred Rogers. And
my God!
Yeah, he taught you a whole lot about dignity, and I've seen this story before, and I said if I get Kiska on my conversations with, he's got to tell that story because it speaks volumes about Fred Rogers, and he isn't just a kids show host. You can learn a lot from this guy, and this story is just a gem. So. Go ahead. You got the story about Mr. Rogers and his neighborhood.
Well, I was out in Los Angeles, and I was a TV critic for the Detroit News, and we would be out there for 3 weeks in January, 3 weeks in July with these big, sumptuous dinners. And this particular one, Television Critics Association Awards. We were giving a big award to Fred. And somehow, don't ask me how this happened. Usually the big guys, the Washington Post guys, the New York Times guys get posed, at the great tables. Well, for some reason, I got put in between Fred Rogers and Angelica Houston, of all people.
Nice seat.
Real nice seat. Drew Carey is doing the awards, by the way, and let me do a turn here. Right before we walked in, there's Drew Carey in a yellow sport jacket, and it was the guy that played Carlin on the old Newhart show. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I ended up at a drinks table with Drew and this guy. And I'm going, hell, God strike me dead, because it's all going to go downhill from here. So what happens is so the dinner starts, and Carrie tells the filthiest joke, which I'm not even sure I'd repeat this to you to your face, Jim.
I wouldn't want to hear it, I don't think.
Well, it was a funny joke, but it was so off color. I'm in shock, and I'm sitting next to Fred Rogers. And I'm going, oh, man. First of all, Drew wasn't being a jerk. And by the way, it was not meant it was offensive, but I'm still sitting next to Fred Rogers. And he says, by the way, I wanted to make sure that I can now go away saying a dirty joke.
But at best, Tim, that had to be awkward. At its very best.
That's the best way, the only way you could describe it. So I've got Fred on my left, Angelica Houston on my right. Now she's dating Jack Nicholson at this point, and I'm going, what could possibly horrify Angelica Houston?
Right.
This did. She was like, her eyes were popping out of her head.
Oh, jeez.
And I look over to Fred, and he's like totally impassive. I know he's hearing it, and the joke finishes, and finally I want to lean over to him and I say, pretty nice neighborhood we live in, Mr. Rogers? But I was smart enough not to say that. But he was totally non-judgmental. And then time comes up to get his award from Drew, and he could not have been more gracious to Drew Carey. And he gave this speech that literally had me in tears and had a whole bunch of other people in tears. And I'm thinking, what it was it told me what this guy was, the fact that he didn't let that get to him and treated everybody with grace and dignity. And he treated people in grace and dignity in such a way that, I'm sitting next to Fred Rogers and I'm going, this guy is, you talk about an icon, you used that word before. This guy is the true icon. And he's treating me like I'm a big deal, which, I'm not under anybody's definition. And that was the kind of guy he was. So no, he taught me a lot just being next to him that one evening just taught me a lot about treating everybody with respect, no matter what the circumstances. And, the best of these folks, and Fred Rogers was one of them. It was just an amazing thing to see. I'll take that with me, to my grave, hopefully, that that was quite the evening.
That's a great story. I'm so glad you've shared that with us. Thanks, Tim. Tim, I can't thank you enough for being on our podcast. Great stuff. Yep. This is the stuff I love because it's the history of Detroit from a guy who was right there in the foxhole with all of them, and you know the real stuff, and you still do it, and you're very interesting. And thanks for being around. It's great to talk to you about this stuff.
All right, Jim, thank you very much for the invite. I appreciate it.
You bet. Take care. If you are engaged in history at all, Tim Kiska is the keeper of secrets, in my opinion. As a lifelong Michigan native and a Detroit fan, Detroit has always been my big city. With all its problems and successes, it's still my city, and I'm so happy that Tim Kiska is around to keep its history alive and well. And we didn't get around to talking about the history of our sports teams, which Tim is fully able to do. Maybe another episode, huh? Hey, keep an eye on my Facebook page, Jim Brandstatter76, and my Twitter account, @JimBrandstatter, for more information on upcoming episodes of Conversations With. You can also find them on all of your favorite podcast platforms. You can also go to thebrandyshow.com or jimbrandstatter.com and navigate your way to both Season 1 and Season 2 episodes of Conversations With.